A tough week for incumbents. I'm Charlie Sykes. Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was, the presidential race reaches fever pitch and even the Pope gets involved. Justice Antonin Scalia's death sets off a political firestorm. The state assembly wrapped up its legislative session with a familiar scene at the Capitol as Latino protesters flooded Madison. But we start with Wisconsin's own election surprises. In a year of the unexpected, we probably should have expected that a volatile electorate would deliver some surprises of their own here, even in a small turnout, supposedly sleepy primary election, and they did. In the race for state Supreme Court, incumbent Justice Rebecca Bradley and Dane County Judge Joanne Kloppenburg advanced to the April 5th general election, but Bradley's 2-point margin was much closer than observers had expected. In Milwaukee, warning signs for incumbents there too. Both Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett and County Executive Chris Abele failed to win 50% of the vote in the primary. Barrett got just 45% of the vote against his April challenger, Alderman Bob Donovan. But County Executive Chris Abele, who spent more than $1 million on his campaign, actually was outvoted by his challenger, State Senator Chris Larson. Larson got 44.8% to Abele's 44.2%, a difference of just 708 votes out of more than 107,000 votes cast. Now, joining me on our panel this morning, defense attorney Dan Adams, former state representative Michelle Litjens, political strategist Lynne DeBruin, and the managing editor of RightWisconsin.com, Collin Roth. By the way, Michael Holt is doing fine and he will be back. But what was the biggest surprise in this election, Dan Adams?
Oh, well, I think the county executive, how close that was a huge surprise. I expected it to be a 10-point difference for Abele. I think I can attribute that to Abele running just upbeat, positive messages, and Larson seeing this as, I got to take him down with negativity, and he's run a blanket negative campaign with a lot of outside money from the Working Families Party, which is really just a pass-through for public sector unions.
A little bit of complacency, a little bit of real vulnerability, though, for Chris Abele?
Well, yeah, and ironically, I think it's actually a good thing because now that campaign is focused on making this a choice election and not just a referendum on Chris Abele.
Okay, but you know, you wrote something earlier this week, Collin Roth, that Chris Abele is going to be in a little bit of a problem because he's being hit from the left, that Bernie Sanders vote, and he might have a little bit of a problem getting moderate and conservative voters.
Yeah, I've always thought Chris Abele has had the trouble of having a shrinking constituency. If he's really lost the far left in this county, and if this county is really becoming further and further to the left, that's a problem for him. And so Abele has to kind of get that business community and also get those conservative voters in the suburbs of Milwaukee County. But we know Chris Abele has had some trouble with some of those conservative voters, and especially in his attempt to take out Sheriff David Clark.
Yeah, that $250,000 he spent, he could use that money that he spent trashing Sheriff Clark, he could use it for his own reelection, and it's going to create a little bit of a problem with grassroots conservative voters.
Yeah, and I talked to more than one Republican who lived in the county who did not vote for Chris Abele, just did not vote in that election.
Okay, you're a longtime observer of county politics. That was a surprise, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I think only Larson's internal campaign staff predicted a win, and clearly they've been doing some polling, and plus they are, obviously we're hopeful on his behalf. But the bottom line is, this is a big upset. It's only 708 votes or so, but it really does signal that it reminds people that Milwaukee County, not necessarily the whole state, but this is Milwaukee County, and it's a Democratic county.
It's a liberal Democratic
and it's in
county.
an election year, and it's not just that Chris Abele has failed to really make himself well known and attached to particular key issues. It's also that Democrats who don't like Chris Abele have made a very good case that Abele, in their minds, isn't really a Democrat. And so what's happened is people who are Democrats who look at him and say, oh, he's had far too many alliances with the conservative right, are more angry at him than they'd be angry at Scott Walker.
I saw a lot of that direct mail, those lit pieces that have Scott Walker and Chris Abele.
Two sides of the same coin.
So he's being hammered. On the other hand, I know a lot of Republicans who are saying they're never going to forgive him for what he did to Clark, and they assume that if he was reelected that he would run against Scott Walker in 2018. So he's in an interesting position, isn't he?
I completely agree with you, and I think looking at the turnout, though, and kind of getting past just Milwaukee, I was very surprised at how well Joanne Kloppenburg did across the state.
I want to talk about that,
And it also talks about that enthusiasm. We had seen so many more Republicans turn out in Iowa and New Hampshire. I am wondering if, this is actually just an example that Wisconsin really is a purple state, because we did see a much higher turnout for Rebecca Larson Rebecca Bradley, sorry, for the Supreme Court race than we had expected, but at the same time we also saw higher numbers.
Well, it was interesting because the turnout was up 55%. So much about the so much for the photo ID suppressing the vote. But yes, Rebecca Bradley did get, she overperformed what other conservative candidates have gotten, but liberals are obviously jazzed. Is she in trouble? I mean, when you have an incumbent that gets under 50%, it's always a red flag.
I think we do have to be concerned.
Is she going to be dragged down by Scott Walker's numbers?
I think she's going to be dragged down a little bit. So I think the job now really is to go after Joanne Kloppenburg for who she is, because I think that we didn't get to see that enough.
Okay, is this going to be a referendum on Scott Walker in the Supreme Court election?
That's what the left and Kloppenburg are going to do. You're not going to see a single ad or mail piece that doesn't say crony or Walker crony or put those two together. What I think you saw was a real wake-up call and it's a wake-up call for conservatives who want to keep that Supreme Court. Because in many ways, Rebecca Bradley didn't do poorly, but Joanne Kloppenburg did really well.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's going to be a referendum on Scott. I mean, I know that they want to make it. This will be a referendum on what kind of a judge do you want to be, on whether you're tough on crime, all of those things. And remember, Joanne Kloppenburg was run before, and there's going to be ads out there with that quote where she says, well, I'm really not about being tough on crime, and you're going to have much more comparative advertising. But I agree with you, Dan. One of the things that we did see is that apparently, despite what people say, positive advertising alone does not work. And the candidates that relied strictly on positive advertising just didn't do that well. So what is your glass half full and what is your glass half empty this week? Let's go around the table. Dan Adams, you're first.
Charlie, my glass is half full because Thursday's rally at the Capitol by Wisconsin Latinos was a demonstration of how important their population is to our state's agricultural and other industries. My glass is half empty because the Republican Party continues to ignore the changing demographics in this country and refuses to allow any honest debate over how to improve America's immigration policies.
Michelle Litjens.
My glass is half empty because 85% of millennials supported Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire and Iowa. It is half full because surveys show that they don't know what socialism means. And if we say a government-run economy, we win over 60% of the millennial support.
Lynne DeBruin.
Well, my glass is half full because a federal judge ordered Apple to help the FBI break into the cell phone of one of the men behind the San Bernardino terrorist attack. But it's half empty because Apple is refusing to comply with the order.
Collin Roth.
My glass is half full because incumbent Justice Rebecca Bradley's vote totals really outperformed Pat Roggensack and David Prosser in last week's spring primary. It's half empty because so did liberal Judge Joanne Kloppenburg.
Well, my glass is half full because the nation is putting aside its political and ideological differences to honor Justice Antonin Scalia. It's half empty because the President of the United States could not find time to attend his funeral. Now, he's not required to go, but it would have been a gracious and a classy gesture. That President Obama chose not to go was disappointing. Next on Sunday Insight, the death of a Supreme Court justice and the impact on the race for president. And as we go to break, our Insight Countdown shows we are just 2 days away from the Republican caucus in Nevada, where Democrats hold their primary in South Carolina in 6 days. We are 9 days away from Super Tuesday. A dozen states hold primaries and caucuses that day. And the Wisconsin primary and spring election is 44 days away. We'll be right back. A legal giant passes away and a political war over his successor erupts. Justice Antonin Scalia was the Supreme Court's preeminent conservative jurist, and his death last week means the court may now be deadlocked 4-4 on many major cases. Republicans immediately suggested that the decision on the future of the High Court should be left to President Obama's successor and suggested they would block any candidate nominated by President Obama. The issue threatens to be at the center of what was already a tumultuous and divisive presidential campaign. So what should Republicans in the Senate do about Supreme Court nominee Collin Roth?
Well, they laid out one marker. They said they told the president not to nominate someone. He's going to nominate someone. So now we move into the process of what do you do with the nominee? Do you hold hearings? Do you hold a vote? But I think at the end of the day, the Republican majority must block this vote. It's if you didn't think this election was do or die already, it definitely is. A cementing a 5-4 liberal majority on the High Court could potentially erase all conservative gains.
Lynne DeBruin.
I think there's a problem with an automatic dismissal of a candidate before you even know who he is. Never in the history of the United States has a Senate refused to even consider a presidential nominee during an election year. And some of the Republicans who've said that that's the practice of the last 80 years are just flat out wrong. And so I think that obviously the president has every right to nominate one. I think he should. There's more than enough time to consider it. But frankly, given our Constitution, it's perfectly the right of the Senate to decide with their majority that they don't like that candidate if they don't. But to refuse to even consider one, I think, is inappropriate, and I think could bite them in the future. For example, Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president, he nominated someone, I believe it was Brennan, and what happened was he was not voted on in that year. So what he did was he used his presidential recess authority and appointed him.
Yeah, that is not likely to happen. So you know, Senator Ron Johnson is this is going to be an issue. Now, Russ Feingold, interestingly enough, did vote to filibuster the appointment of Justice Alito back in 2005. And yet he's saying that the Senate needs to act right now. So what exactly is the state of play? How's this going to work out?
The reality is, though, the Democrats are held to very different standards than Republicans are. Republicans are always seen as the bullies, and yet the Democrats are the actual bullies, but yet Republicans are held responsible for their actions. It's totally true. Wait 1 second.
Article 2 of the Constitution, our founding document, creates a framework for this, and I'm tired of Democrats and Republicans trying to pit each other against each other. There is a framework for this. The president will nominate, and if he's smart, he'll go to the Republicans and say, give me a list of 12 people, and I'll select somebody, and we will actually have advice and consent, and we'll have, you know, when there's a separation of powers, come to somebody in the middle, have an agreement, be an adult.
Well, I do think that this is one of those moments, though, where I agree with Colin. The Republicans cannot allow this to go through. This has got to be up to the voters, and frankly, this is going to be one of the things that the voters will decide which direction they want to take, because the stakes are so huge. And we've lived under 7 years of post-constitutional presidency. We have seen what happens when you have a regime that ignores the constitutional limits. And every single issue, major issue facing this country, is really at play in this Supreme Court election. So when the voters go to the polls in November, they will not only select a president for 4 years, they will decide what the course of the Supreme Court is for the next 30 and 40 years. And I think that Republicans, rather than letting themselves be cast as obstructionists, need to make the case, first of all, that this is something that the voters should decide on, but also make the case why the Constitution matters, make the case why the Supreme Court matters, because I think they can win more.
I don't want voters choosing our Supreme Court.
The hypocrisy of that is, what I'm tired of is Republicans who say they support the Constitution, and then when this situation happens, and it isn't convenient for them to acknowledge that the President of the United States has the right to nominate and the Senate has the right to hear.
Okay, by the way, so that's a straw man. That's a straw man, because no one is denying that the President has the right to do it.
Republicans are saying they won't even consider sight unseen, name unnamed. I mean, that's absurd. That has never happened in the history of the United States.
You know the last time that a president got a nominee through in an election year when the other party controlled the United States Senate? The year is 1888. You may not want to hear it, but we'll tell you anyway. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice. Dan Adams, you're first.
Well, my advice, if you wonder how State Senator Chris Larson will pay for all the goodies he's promising the public employee unions who are running his campaign, just take out your property tax bill and add a few $100s.
Michelle Litjens.
Well, to Donald Trump, the only person you haven't attacked is God, and I would recommend you don't go there.
Yeah, he's a loser. Lynne DeBruin.
On that line, in a town hall meeting last week, Donald Trump added House Speaker Paul Ryan to his list of Republican losers. Trump said Mitt Romney's presidential campaign ended when he chose Ryan as his running mate. Calling the popular Wisconsin Republican a loser won't be well received here.
Collin Roth.
My advice is for Marquette University. After 2 consecutive years on the dishonorable list of 10 worst schools for free speech, try not to make it 3.
Well, my unsolicited advice, the Waukesha water issue should be a no-brainer from a public health point of view, an economic point of view, and a regional cooperation point of view. My advice for City of Milwaukee officials, your opposition looks petty, and if you want the suburbs to support you, you need to return the favor. Next on Sunday Insight, what, if anything, did we learn from the Day Without Latinos? This looked familiar. More mass protests at the state capitol. Tens of thousands of Hispanics descended on the Capitol last week to protest legislation that would have cut off funds for so-called sanctuary cities and limited the use of local ID cards. Meanwhile, the legislature, the Assembly, scrambled to complete work on a long list of bills ranging from defunding Planned Parenthood to limiting government regulations and cracking down on drunk driving. So, What were the legislature's biggest successes and misses, Michelle Litjens?
There was so much that our legislature has accomplished in this last year and a half of hard work. I mean, they expanded school choice, right to work, repealing prevailing wage, getting rid of John Doe as we knew it, reforming the GAB. They have done so much heavy lifting. In the last couple days, they passed voting electronically, which I think is an asset for the state of Wisconsin. They did some things with college loans. I really think they have worked so hard. They've held the line on property taxes.
Now, what was the miss? What's
the one thing they missed?
Yes.
Man, they did not do anything about transportation funding, and it is a huge hole that we are going to have to continue to
So they must be dripping with sweat that they worked so hard that they adjourned for the earliest that they ever have in a generation. I mean, it's February. These people get paid for a full-time job, and they've got the rest of the year basically to campaign in their districts. That's a big loss. But listen, school accountability is still on the table. WEDC is still.
You wanted that job, though, right? I mean, there's not.
Once upon a time, when I was younger.
Yes. Former
WEDC,
assembly candidate Dan Adams. Yes.
What I would say is the good things that they did have the cap on property taxes and the cap on tuition. Those are two positive things.
Okay. Collin Roth.
Yeah, I think one of the big, a ton of stuff happened in the last year, but when you think of in the last few weeks, one of the big ones was this Reins Act, which was a major regulatory reform that passed through the Assembly and will go through the Senate, I hope. And then in terms of misses, I think kind of the big obvious one that conservatives were kind of pining for in recent weeks and months was minimum markup, and that kind of sets the stage, I think, for the next budget.
Yeah, they didn't even have a hearing on it. Hits and misses.
Well, I agree with your hits. I think your positives. I think some of the negatives are some of the lists that you said, actually, Michelle. I'm a Democrat. I don't like the fact that they supposedly reformed the GAB, the Governmental Accountability Board, which was a national model because we had judges serving on that commission. It actually was. And now it's going to be mainly political appointees. So great, let's make our regulatory boards even more political than they are. Another big one is the campaign finance reform, which basically helped open up our system to even more special interest campaign fundings, more hidden fundings, and making it harder for people to find out who's actually behind the funding of special interest campaigns. I mean, some of this, Scott Walker signed those bills secretively. He didn't even do a big press release because he knew what it was really doing.
What a shame, Lynn, that we actually now have a campaign finance law that is in line with the First Amendment. I actually agree with Colin. I think one of the big successes was this Reins Act. I think the big miss is minimum markup. I think one of the problems of this legislature, though, was when you ran through all of that legislation, that 100 pieces in the last day. First of all, I'm not even sure how many legislators read those bills, or that we know what's going on. And there may be some really good stuff in there, but we won't know it. At some point, you know, it's like you got a whole year. Why do you have to rush everything through? At least explain it to the public. Now, in terms of this demonstration, I do think that was an impressive demonstration on Thursday, and it is an indication how, in fact, activists, though, are going to use these wedge issues. And I think that at some point, I think the Republicans and conservatives need to recognize the way in which you are going to have some of the activists who are going to be mobilizing, and maybe sometimes deceptively mobilizing people, but are going to turn them out for big rallies like that and maybe to vote. So what is it you don't get? What is it you don't get this week? Let's go around the table. Dan Adams, you're first.
I don't get the science behind last week's first direct observations of gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time predicted by Albert Einstein 100 years ago. Luckily, Michelle Litjens is here to explain it. Michelle?
Michelle Litjens.
$20 billion. Charlie, what I don't get is why Adele, the music icon, is being attacked by feminists because she said becoming a mother gave her purpose. Do feminists hate children?
Lynne DeBruin.
After students taped swastikas and a picture of Adolf Hitler on his door, a University of Wisconsin-Madison Jewish student asked that the offenders not be demonized and use the situation to unite rather than divide his fellow students. How is it that a college student is more dignified and mature than some of the candidates running for president?
Yeah, kindergartners. Well. Colin Roth.
What I don't get is how Russ Feingold can claim he wasn't being partisan when he joined Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden in filibustering Justice Samuel Alito in 2006.
Well, what I don't get is how County Executive Chris Abele managed to lose that primary to Chris Larson. Might be those gravitational waves. He'd better figure out what went wrong quickly. Next on Sunday Insight, our panel picks the winners and losers of the week. But first, here's your morning news update. It's time for our panel to pick the winners and losers of the week. Dan Adams, you're first.
My winners are new Milwaukee County judges Cindy Davis and Michael Hanrahan, who were just appointed to the bench. Both are very qualified for the job. Congratulations. My losers are those stuck in Milwaukee's circuit or municipal court systems, which, despite some very good judges presiding over them, are a tangled culture of bureaucratic ineptness, wasted resources, and a deep lack of accountability. Other counties don't accept this culture, nor should we.
Michelle Litjens.
My winner is Gary Sinise. You may remember him as Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump. At the Grammy Awards, he asked for one brief second to remember those serving in the military. Thank you for reminding the attendees about our real winners of the night. The losers of the week are the teenage Black Lives Matter gang who beat up and robbed a Marine veteran in D.C. last week. They harassed him inside McDonald's, and when he ignored them, they surrounded him as he walked out and knocked him unconscious.
Lynne DeBruin.
Well, my winner is Senator Chris Larson. Virtually no one predicted his victory over Chris Abele in the Milwaukee County executive primary race. Well done, but watch out. Abele's ads in the primary were positive. Now, expect a war. My loser, again, is Donald Trump, who still insists President Obama is a Muslim and questions Ted Cruz's Christianity, but is so appalled that the Pope might judge his own faith that he called the spiritual leader of 1.2 billion Christians disgraceful. God is the true judge, but when it comes to Pope Francis and Mr. 2 Corinthians judging matters of faith, the Pope's motives trounce Trump's every time.
Collin Roth.
My winner this week is Senator Ron Johnson, who is helping open doors for an innovative inner-city faith-based program that is connecting workers in Milwaukee with job opportunities outside of the city. Johnson offers real solutions for real people. My losers are incumbents. A sitting Supreme Court justice, the Milwaukee County executive, and the Milwaukee mayor all registered below 50% in last week's primary. For all of them, this has to be a wake-up call. Unless you've got something to offer, people will look for change.
Well, my loser, the U.S. Constitution, which lost a champion this week when Justice Scalia passed away. My winner, well, our colleague Michael Holt, who is being honored later tonight by the Milwaukee Black Media Association for his 40 years of activism, advocacy, and journalism, and it is richly, richly deserved. Thanks for joining us and joining me for my radio show Monday morning on News Radio 620 WTMJ from 8:30 until noon. Have a great week.